Now on to the presentation, Identifying and Managing Protected Content for the Financial Services Industry. Discussing today's topic will be Kate O'Brien and Bobby Basile. Kate is Analytics Consulting Director for Renew Data. Kate has a Master's of Information Science and has taught graduate-level courses in information retrieval at Rutgers University. With more than 15 years of experience in the e-discovery industry, Kate has been in the trenches with many financial services entities and leverages her unique background to help clients construct more efficient keyword strategies, search and retrieval techniques, and data organization schemas. Bobby is Director of Consulting and Analytics at Renew Data. Bobby leverages 25 years of experience in the legal and records management industries to help financial services entities and other Fortune 500 legal departments minimize risk, reduce costs, and deliver more effective e-discovery solutions. I will now turn it over to Bobby to get us started.
Thank you, Linda. Kate, do you want to move to the next slide? Today we're going to cover a variety of topics around protected content. I wanted to clarify at the beginning that the context of our presentation and the context of the way that we are speaking of protected content is in the process of electronic discovery and in document review. We are not going to cover today how to identify protected or sensitive content in general data security context or in your overall organization. We'll be discussing this in the context of as it relates to the process of document review in the context of electronic discovery. Some of the unique challenges in electronic discovery is that it intentionally sidesteps the organization's data security policies, in that the entire purpose of electronic discovery is to collect documents that may be relevant in a particular investigation or litigation and intentionally disclose documents to outside parties, parties outside the organization. So whereas the organization generally has very stringent data security requirements around cyber attacks and entities being able to access secure documents and prevent the inadvertent disclosure, the entire process of e-discovery circumvents those processes. So we're going to talk about ways and the types of protected, examples of the types of protected content, ways that as an organization you can centralize the identification and management of protected content, how to identify what protected content is in the context of your organization, and ways to, techniques to use to identify that the content within the document review and workflows to put in place to ensure that these documents are not being inadvertently disclosed as part of a production to opposing parties in e-discovery. So the first thing we want to talk about today is the types of protected content. So Kate, if you'll move to the next slide, please. Some examples of protected content include confidential supervisory information. And this information is documentation and communications between the organization and its regulators related to the regulators' oversight activities. This particular type of content is a privileged content that only the regulator can waive. So what that means is that the regulator actually owns this content. So the documents, the communications around the activities having to do with the way that the regulators provide the oversight activities of the organization is owned by the regulators. I've included the law here that covers this particular content, but there are very stringent penalties for the improper disclosure of this information. Probably the most important court case as it relates to the qualified bank examination privilege is this In Re subpoena served upon the comptroller of currency, and I've provided the case law there in case you want to look that up. But as you can see, the fine is pretty stringent in that, or the penalty is pretty stringent in that it can result in criminal penalties and imprisonment of up to 10 years for the inadvertent disclosure of confidential supervisory information. And this is specific, of course, to financial services industry. The same with suspicious activity reports, and this is reports that financial institutions are required to file when they detect or suspect violation of federal law as it relates to money laundering or other violations of the Bank Secrecy Act. The violation or penalties around disclosing, inadvertent disclosure of suspicious activity reports or anything that discloses the presence of a suspicious activity report can result in civil penalties up to $100,000 for each violation and criminal penalties up to $250,000 and/or imprisonment for 5 years. These are just a couple of examples. Some additional examples include state regulators that have oversight activities, as well as other types of sensitive information which we'll cover. Unlike the attorney work product or attorney-client privilege, where the consequences of disclosure for the disclosure is legal penalties or challenges as it relates to that particular lawsuit, disclosure of protected content in this context can result in criminal issues for the organization or the potentially even the individuals involved in the disclosure. So Kate, do you want to go to the next slide? We'll cover some more examples. Additional protected content is personally identifiable information, also known as PII, or non-public information NPI. And this is all of the information that I'm sure everyone is familiar with that would be confidential information related to individuals, such as the full name, maiden name, mother's name, Social Security numbers, financial accounts or credit card numbers, personal addresses, streets. This information is protected by a variety of laws, not the least of which is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, Data Protection Act of 1999, requiring financial services companies to protect the confidentiality and integrity of non-public personal information and to ensure that it is secure from unauthorized access. Again, as I mentioned, the general awareness around protecting this type of information is from inadvertent access or unauthorized access. But as I said, in the e-discovery space, we're intentionally gathering information and documentation that potentially has this type of content in it and turning it over voluntarily to outside parties. So it's not that it's unauthorized access, it's unauthorized inadvertent disclosure of content that has this protected content in it. So the civil and monetary fines can be up to $1 million or more, as well as prison sentences and other challenges that come along with that. I won't cover in detail the attorney work product and attorney-client privilege because this is a widely known type of protected content that we've been dealing with in the context of e-discovery for as long as e-discovery has been around. So I won't cover the definition of that or penalties because I'm sure you're all aware of those, but it will be the process to manage that type of protected content will also be covered in the techniques that we talk about today. As I mentioned, these are just a couple of examples. So what we want to talk about today is ways that the organization can manage and mitigate the risks of this inadvertent disclosure of protected content. What we suggest is that the corporation owns the process because the corporation owns the risk of inadvertent disclosure. So this is an area where the risk can be mitigated extensively by the corporation taking ownership and defining the process by which the protected content is defined, the way that it's identified, the criteria that's used globally to identify and surface potentially protected content in a document collection, as well as defining workflows to ensure that the documents that contain potentially protected content are flagged prior to the beginning of a document review, so that as documents are presented to outside counsel for review, specific documents are flagged as being containing potentially protected content, and ensuring that those documents that contain potentially protected content must have eyes on them prior to the release of the documents to opposing parties or in investigations, which results in putting in place consistent pre-production audits and screens of documents to ensure that no document that potentially contains protected content in it is being included in a production. So we'll cover that process in a little bit more detail, and then Kate's going to cover how you go about identifying protected content. So let's just examine real quickly what a workflow to manage this, to centralize the identification and management of protected content might look like. And this is at a high level, of course, but it needs to be customized for every individual organization. But the first step is to define the types of protected content that your organization is required to protect, whether it be confidential supervisory information, suspicious activity reports, PII, state-related regulatory information, or a variety of other requirements that you may have. But to first define the categories of protected content that you need to identify and proactively surface in your e-discovery document reviews. And then to create criteria to identify that potentially protected content, whether you're looking for content that is text-based, that has terms in it, or if you're looking to identify patterns, numeric patterns or alphanumeric patterns that might be social security numbers or date of birth or bank account numbers or credit card numbers. And then creating criteria to identify each category of protected content. Of course, documenting that criteria, and then screening and centrally flagging every document collection with the documents that hit on those criteria that you have created to identify each category, meaning that this is done in every single case in the same way with the same criteria. Instead of it being ad hoc and relying upon outside counsel, what we're suggesting is that the risk be mitigated by the corporation defining the criteria and instructing its service providers or anyone who processes their documents in the course of e-discovery to proactively run the criteria against every single document collection and flag those documents. And then put in place a process to ensure that any of the documents that are identified as having potentially protected content in them are reviewed by your outside counsel attorneys, and ensuring that a document that has been marked as containing potentially protected content is not included in any set of documents to be produced to opposing parties. And then as documents are confirmed as being in fact protected content, maintaining that designation for that particular document and leveraging that decision so that every time that particular document is included in an e-discovery document review, that designation follows that document so that you do not have to have it re-reviewed, and once the decision is made, you're gaining the leverage of having that decision. And then if a document is identified as being protected content but was not hit by one of your criteria or your screens in advance, examining what criteria, what language, or what patterns of document context that document has in order to refresh and modify the criteria so that you have a constant process, a feedback loop of refining and testing and refining your screens to identify protected content. So I'll turn it over to Kate, and Kate's going to focus on the tough part here, which is how to create the criteria to identify potentially protected content in the course of electronic document review. So Kate, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Bobby. The first step is defining what it is that you're looking for, and that's certainly one of the harder steps and more challenging because you don't know exactly what was said, how it was said, and the language that was used. So the process that we recommend is really to approach this not by sitting down with a piece of paper and a pen and just kind of writing down all the words that you can think of, but approach it in a much more thoughtful manner. It really is more of almost a research project. And the first thing we do is to build an outline of about statements. And that's kind of an awkward phrase, but really what you're doing is you're trying to look for documents that are about a certain thing. And that's what you want to define, what that certain thing is. And obviously there's specific rules of things that you have to determine, specific names of people, names of organizations and entities, as well as just some conceptual information that you need to define. So we start with this about statements, and we're looking for documents that are about whatever. And I'll talk about an example in a minute. But and through the process, you build that type of about statement for each thing that you're looking for. And this is something that's going to be kind of iterative. It's not something you're going to sit down and do in an afternoon. It's a thoughtful process, and certainly share with colleagues and get input on it. But what you want to do is to build a statement that really kind of covers everything that you might possibly be looking for. And then we break down those statements into what we call logical components. And I'm going to explain this and give an example of how we recommend going about this. And from those components, then you're going to build synonyms, because not everybody calls it an audit. They might call it a review. They might call it analysis. They might call it, something else. You want to think about the synonyms for terms that they're going to use. And the goal here is we want to define what can't possibly be protected content, because it doesn't have any of this language that we know we're looking for, that we know documents might be about this, so that might be protected content. And it's all about identifying what is potentially protected content so that you can do that next stage of the review. So here's an example of kind of what I was looking for, and this is certainly very simplistic, but it gives you an idea of the approach. So if we take that about statement and we want to say we are looking for documents about the FRB or state bank audits, obviously, as I said, very simplistic. But we would break that down into, okay, if that's what the about statement says, then logically the document has to somehow mention the FRB or the state bank that is involved and the word audit or a synonym for the word audit. It has to have those two components in it, or else it's not about that. So you want to add some context to the FRB by combining it with the word audit. And you can use your proximity when you're doing searching to improve your precision. And we're going to talk about precision and recall just a little bit. But this is how we break that down. So you create these statements, these logical statements that says we're looking for documents about this. It means it has to have this term, and maybe it has 3 sections or maybe even 4. But you combine those to improve the chances that the document is going to actually capture potentially protected content. So I mentioned recall and precision. This has always been the kind of the challenge in information retrieval because it's a real balancing act between your recall, which is you want to make sure that you've captured everything, simplistically put, or the fraction of relevant instances that are retrieved. So how much from your corpus have you retrieved? But you also, the precision of what you're doing is very important because you don't want to get bogged down with a lot of, false positives. documents that don't really talk about what it is that you were searching for, or aren't really about that. They have the right word, but it's a completely different context. So the balance between recall and precision is always a challenge. And typically when you do straightforward keyword searching, you're going for recall. It's just like cast a great big huge net, gather up as much as you can, and then spend countless hours going through a lot of junk. You know, that's certainly one way to handle it, maybe not the most cost-efficient, cost-effective, because you waste a lot of time looking at material that really isn't relevant. So you want to improve your precision because that's capturing the highest number of documents that are actually relevant to what it is you're looking for. But it is a very fine line, and it's a tough balance to accomplish. Some of the things I'm going to talk about will give you some tips on how to improve your precision without degrading the recall of your searches. Let's talk about keywords a little bit, because this is typically the approach that most people take. As I said, they sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil, and they just kind of brainstorm words that they should search for. And it's an ongoing process, and as new words come up or somebody thinks of it, they just add it to the list. Sometimes not very effective because there's lots of issues with just straight keyword searching. What I want to do is to just give you some examples of some of the challenges with just doing that. There's the lack of context. If you search for the word federal, thinking that, well, you know, they're not always going to call it the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. They might call it something else. They might just say federal. That's true. But if you search for just the word federal, you're also going to get references to Federal Express, the federal tax, all sorts of what we would call false positives. So you have to, this is one of those things you have to balance. Do you balance it by being more specific by saying Federal Reserve, or do you go broad and capture a lot of noise? There's also the problem with ambiguous terms. Now, you may think searching for the person's name, oh, you know, we'll just search for their last name, that'll work. Well, here's two examples of two people involved in the banking system that if you search for just their last name, you know, particularly Philip May, if you search for just May, obviously you're going to get a lot of false positives with that. But you have the challenge of that people aren't always going to be called exactly what you think. It's not always going to be Philip R. May or Philip May. You have to work your strategy around the people's names to make sure that you capture everything. And that's done with proximity and possibly with wildcards. But again, it's the balance between the recall and the precision. But this is one of the problems with keywords as well. You also have stop words. And you know, every search engine that is used, you know, there can be different rules to it. We have a couple of different search engines that are used at Renew. There's Lucene, the Lucene search engine that's used in a number of our applications. There's DT Search. There's straight SQL searching. And those different search engines have different rules about what their wildcarding, how their wildcarding works, how their stemming works, even in what stop words are. Now, stop words are words that are just not even seen by the index. The index just skips over them. In this instance, Board of Governors, well, of is typically, and I'm using air quotes around typically because it is something that can vary from search engine to search engine. Of is a stop word, so the system wouldn't even see that word. So if you're searching for Board of Governors, you would want to use a proximity to combine those two terms. Something like out of time might be a phrase that we've encountered in some work that we've done. Typically, as I said, of is a stop word. Out is frequently a stop word as well. So that search, if you search for out of time as a phrase, it would really just search for the word time. So you have to be cognizant of those types of issues and make sure that your vendor, whoever you're working with, can make adjustments to their search engine, because you can kind of force the search engine to index those words. They're just default. But you want to think about that up front. Other problems with keywords, people's names, entities, always lots of issues with that. You know, one of the most famous ones is AT&T. You know, A is typically a stop word. The ampersand doesn't get indexed. You end up searching for the letter T. I mean, totally ineffective. People's names, you know, like a Richard. If you search for Richard Fisher, that might be great, but what about his nicknames? And is he called Rich or Rick or Dick or whatever? You know, you can put in all the variables to make sure that you capture everything, or obviously just, you know, get the right information and search for that. But this is another thing to keep in mind when you're searching for people's names. And as I said, entities and company names are also always a challenge. You don't want to be too limiting by putting an Inc. or an LLC at the end of it, because most people don't write that way. And that's what one of the things we try to do, is to think about how people write about things in their correspondence, not the proper name of the company, but when people are emailing, and email communication gets very casual, very fast, you want to think about how they use it in that context, because those are the types of terms that you want to make sure are in your library here. The proximity that you use is also important. I never recommend that people search the name just as it is, Richard Fisher, because 9 times out of 10, somebody somewhere is going to put his initial in there. Always want to add some proximity and be you know, thoughtful about the number of spaces you put, the proximity that you use between terms. One thing that's also frequently a problem with keywords is the overuse of wildcards, or the truncating of words too early. And truncating is just where you put that wildcard. Frequently I've seen REG with a wildcard at the end to capture, you know, all the different variations of regulate and regulator and regulated and regulating, etc. But if you truncate or put that wildcard that close, cut that word off that close, look at all the noise words that are possibly you're going to pull up to. Regular, register, regards. All of those are legitimate hits to REG wildcard, but they certainly have nothing to do with regulations. So be, again, cognizant of where you use your wildcards and how you use them. Sometimes it's safer to just put the actual words there so you don't get a lot of noise, because that can be a real challenge and the root of a lot of false positives. Email signatures is another challenge, both for PC information and particularly for privilege. This has always been a challenge because everybody kind of requires an email signature at the end of your email, so that confidentiality and, you know, this is attorney-client privilege or whatever the corporation's email signature is, causes a lot of problems when you try to search for the word privilege or the search for the word confidential, because the search engine indexes that information just along with everything else. So those documents are going to get returned just because that content is in the email signature. There are a variety of ways to work around that. And one of the methods that we use frequently is to identify, through the use of a process, we can identify the strings or the phrase that we don't want the search engine to index. And the search engine actually doesn't index that, so it doesn't find these false positives or false representations of the word privilege in a document. Because we said, hey, ignore this piece right here, don't look at this. So it allows you to actually search the real content of the document, the body of the message, rather than that signature block. And that can be really critical to improving the results of your searches, because those signature blocks really kill you when you're trying to search for that type of terminology. I keep wanting to stop and ask if anybody has questions, but I know I'm not supposed to till the end, so we'll keep going. So let's talk about some tools to help put this all together. If you've thought about, you know, creating those about statements and you've put them together and you've gone through, you know, and checked for your keywords and resolved some of those problems, one of the other things that we recommend doing is use the actual words from your corpus to help inform your decisions about the synonyms and terminology that you want to use. And we have a process where you can get that, but basically it's just the show me every word that's in the corpus. It's basically the vocabulary of your document set. Really helps you identify the right language to use, how people talk about certain things. You know, we found people frequently develop kind of internal nicknames for a project or a process, and possibly even for an entity. You know, they might call the Federal Reserve some, you know, FEDI or something. I'm making that up, but they might have nicknames, and there's no way for you to know that unless you can actually see the vocabulary of the documents and make some determinations. And what's interesting is those words, if they've sorted by the order of appearance, which is a process that we can do, those words will jump out at you, and you'll say, why is this word here? And you can do a little investigation and find the right language that people are actually using. What do they call things? How do they refer to things? Also allows you to identify possible synonyms. Certainly you can use a thesaurus, but the thesaurus isn't always going to have the right context of the term and how it's used within your organization. So the word list will actually help you identify those terms very easily. Also helps you identify unique terms. Again, one is the example of a nickname for a certain process, names for certain locations, certain meeting rooms, or the type of meeting that you might have. Things that you might not be common knowledge will really be identified and highlighted when you are able to look at that word list. Another really important one is misspellings. Now, typically in a document review, we don't worry about misspellings too often, but in the situation of protected content, I think it's really important to recognize that people type things wrong all the time. And, you know, without some type of word list, you can sit there and try to think of all the different ways that somebody might misspell something, but with the word list, you will actually be able to see those. But there's, you know from your own typing, humans are very, very fallible, so I mistype words all the time, and you would miss them from a regular search. So it's another factor that you want to fold into your analysis. Some other tools that you can use. Filtering. How can you filter? So say you run your searches and now you've got all of this data that it's been identified as possibly protected content, and it's massive because, typically you're going to go for recall because you have to be safe, because those are pretty hefty fines that Bobby outlined. But let's think of some methodologies to review this material in a more efficient and more effective manner to, again, be more cost effective. Obviously, you can use metadata to mine and filter the data. We have a number of recommendations around different ways to use that additional information that's beyond just the text of the document. One thing that it can be a big plus is to use the MD5 hash. Now, most vendors use some type of hashing algorithm to identify duplicates, but it's identified at kind of the highest level. So it identifies an email family as a duplicative email. But it doesn't identify and remove those individual family members. So at the end of the day, you end up with maybe 25 copies of the same PDF that outline some, new banking rules or whatever that was disseminated around the organization and passed around among people. Your standard deduping process isn't going to identify those multiple emails as duplicates because they're not. It's a series of people communicating and just forwarding this same document among themselves. But a different process that you can use once you've identified your set of documents is say, okay, let's look at everything now. Let's identify all of my attachments that are duplicative. Oh, look at this. Here's 25 copies of this PDF document. Let's look at one of them. Let's determine that, gee, this really isn't PC, not protected content. Mark it as non-responsive or non-PC, whatever coding scheme you're using, and then propagate that same coding out to all those other 24 documents. Why look at all 25? It's exactly the same thing because that's what the hash value tells you. Look at one of them, propagate that coding out to the others. Saves huge amounts of time in reusing that information, and you're safe because it's obviously a duplicate, and just propagate it out. Another methodology that you can use is put file names, put group-like things together. A lot of times you'll end up with, massive amounts of Excel documents or something. You can use those to, you can sort by the file name in order to look and see, oh, look, we have 35 copies of the weekly report from July 21st. We can, look at all of those together and code all of those together. Identify and dismiss trusted senders. I'm going to explain trusted senders in a little bit. Let me come back to that. Another methodology that you can use is auto-redaction, which identifies patterns and then automatically applies those redactions. That's a real time saver and a really great tool to use in this context. Some examples, and I talked about these a little bit. This one is about the attachments to emails that are not deduped. As I said, it's a really significant way to reduce the volumes up to 25%. It could possibly be even more than that. But if you think about all of those types of attachments, that here's a real interesting one that everybody encounters. Everybody has a little logo in their signature line. Well, when your documents get processed, that gets attached as an attachment, and if you're looking at doing your review and reviewing this family of documents, you have to look at all of those, or maybe you can just both tag those as not protected content and not even put those forward for review. Another method just to save time in identifying your protected content. Excel documents are always a challenge. This is where I was saying you can group them by file name. You can easily scan and identify, here's everything, here's the same weekly report, here's the same manual. If you group them in that way using some of that metadata to inform your decisions, then you can move through that more quickly. You can use some clustering technologies or clustering techniques to help you organize Excel documents. Find documents that have the same column headings, the same row headings, put them together, again, just for ease of review. I go back to the trusted senders. I call it trusted senders. I think it's called by different names, but basically, identify the sources of this data. Many people in the organization probably subscribe to various newsletters and weekly feeds, et cetera, and depending on your search strategy, you're going to get a lot of those as results, just because that's the nature of the content of these publications. But it's certainly not something that you need to review as protected content. The one technique to use is to identify the domain names. You can have your vendor produce a list of domain names from the data. You can review those and say, yeah, okay, we don't really need to look at anything that came from the WallStreetJournal.com or anything that came from Bankrate.com, because we know that's public content. It's not ours. We don't need to worry about that. So how do you improve your results? So we've talked about some of the problems with keywords and some of the techniques to help filter your results that you've gotten. But how can you continuously improve the results that you're getting? So you built your searches, your queries that you're going to use. You've tested them. You want to refine them. It's kind of a continual process. I mentioned early on that this is iterative, because you want to do your work, look at your results, make some changes, tweak some of the searches. This isn't quite right. We have to change this. We want to improve this. This is getting too much. This is missing things. And you do that through this build, test, refine process. You can also take the next step of building an internal language library to reuse. This is something we highly recommend, because while this is an iterative process and ongoing, it shouldn't be recreated with each project. You don't want to reinvent the wheel each time you have an e-discovery review to go through there. You need to examine this type of content. So you want to keep that list. You want to keep it current. You want to keep the names and the entities that you have listed current. Make sure that everybody's included. One of the Board of Governors changes, you want to change the name or whatever. You also should probably build a little dictionary of acronyms. There's all sorts of acronyms used in the banking industry, and you want to make sure that you captured all of them. Keeping a running list of and searching for both the acronym as well as the full name of the entity or organization or foundation or whatever it is that you're searching for is important. You can also keep a dictionary of those misspellings and common misspellings. And then next time you have another project, you have, here's my whole list of misspellings that we've seen in the past for the word federal, and just reuse them. Keep a dictionary of people and entities, as I mentioned. You want to keep those names current, keep the entity names current. And then you want to audit your results. You have to test in order to make sure that what you've done is achieving your goals, and that you are indeed finding everything that you need to find, that your recall is high enough, but your precision is the best that it can be. Now, you know, everybody is fallible, and a human eyes-on review is not perfect. Just isn't. I mean, I think human review rates are like at 70% or something like that. I mean, error rates are pretty high. But what you can do is test your results. And while it, too, is not perfect, because nothing is, but at least it can give you a sense of, okay, I've done the best job that I can do. I've tested to to this criteria. I can make these types of statements. And that, at least, is representation that you have put your best efforts forward into this process. And I would think go a long way to mitigate against any of those fines that might possibly get imposed if indeed an error has occurred and a document was missed. We use sampling frequently in our work, both we use it on our operations line as well as in our e-discovery work, so we use testing frequently throughout the organization. And very simply, you know, a sample of 1,500 documents will give you a 95% certainty with a plus or minus 2% error rate. But that's a very high level of certainty, and you can go even higher. Your sample number will increase a little bit, but that number that I refer to here is probably the highest level that any organization could expect. But there's a number of ways that you would want to test, because you've got several different buckets of information going here. You have documents that weren't deemed as PC. They didn't hit on any of your searches. They're just sitting over there. Well, you want to make sure that your searches were accurate enough, so you would want to test that pile of documents to make sure that there weren't indeed any statements that you missed. Did you miss an about statement? Did you miss a synonym? So you would want to test that pile of documents. Then you would also want to test the documents that were hit by one of the PC searches, but the human said, no, this isn't PC. Well, that will give you an indication of an area where you may want to improve your searches. Maybe you need a tighter proximity. Maybe you use the wildcard, you know, in a way that was ineffective. But you want to test that set of documents as well. And the last is you want to test the documents that a human said, hey, wait a minute, this is PC, but we didn't capture it in our searches. Because that's an indication that, oh, we've missed something in our PC searches. It's similar to the first one, but a human saw it and said, wait, this needs to be folded in. So if you test in those three ways, do that audit on a regular basis, and as I said, in this iterative process, improve your searches as you go along. You know, at the end of the day, obviously it's going to take some time, but you will constantly be improving that list of searches that you've prepared to identify the protected content from the corpus of documents that you're looking at. So Bobby, I'm going to throw this back to you for the conclusions and kind of a wrap up here. And
thanks, Kate. And then we'll open it up for questions. But just to conclude, as we said, the liability rests with the organization. Generally, what we have found is that organizations at present are relying upon their various outside counsel to identify protected content and to manage it as an extension of privileged content. And that is fraught with risk for a lot of reasons. One, outside counsel might not be focused or even aware of all the categories of protected content that they need to be looking for. For example, your outside counsel may not know that the company has purchased a bank in Arizona and is now subject to the Arizona state regulators and needs to be looking out for that particular type of content. And even if they do know, your various outside counsel may be interpreting the criteria differently as it relates to these various types of protected content. So as I said, the recommendation is to centralize this process, define the categories of protected content the organization needs to be identifying and protecting, creating the criteria, defining it, and refining it in a centralized fashion so that all of the service providers are searching the content and flagging the documents for review consistently. And then, as Kate said, testing and ensuring that the criteria is working effectively and putting in place that refinement loop so that as new criteria is identified, you're able to leverage that going forward. And as documents are deemed to be protected content, ensuring that you have a process in place so that the next time that particular document is relevant in another investigation or litigation, that the review doesn't need to take place again. And one thing I haven't mentioned on here on this slide, but I should, is that training all of your outside counsel on the types of protected content that they should be looking for and screening once they've been identified as being potentially protected content, but conducting that training so that every reviewer is aware of the requirements. And if you have a managed review company that you're working with to do your review, that's a good place to start as well. And then, obviously, the decentralizing this process and the ad hoc identification and abdicating responsibility to outside counsel increases the risk of inadvertent disclosure as opposed to centralized management of this within the organization. So we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Linda, if you want to facilitate the Q&A that has come in while we've been presenting.
Sure thing. And as a reminder, to participate in the Q&A, just type your inquiry into the questions pane at the bottom of your console. The first question we have is, what is the point of reviewing the word list that you had mentioned?
Kate, do you want to take that one? Or do you want me to?
Sorry, I was on mute. The word list is a 100% accurate representation of the language that's contained in the documents that you are looking at. So it can help you in a number of different ways in identifying the synonyms that you might want to use, the way that people talk about certain things. It can obviously help you identify the misspellings, because all of that is indexed and in the vocabulary of that word list. So it just gives you a real sense of how people use the language in the organization, the frequency of certain terms and terminology, and it just really informs you of the way people talk about things. So it can be really enlightening, actually, to look at.
And, of course, increase your precision.
Well, certainly, yes.
Okay, great. The next question we have is, this sounds like a typical keyword process. Am I missing something?
It's a little more expansive than a typical keyword process. I mean, as I said, you can sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil and try to brainstorm all the different ways that people might talk about things. But then you have no methodology for that audit to ensure that you have indeed captured everything. This process is, as I said, it's kind of very thoughtful, and you start with those about statements. So then when you go through that process and you do your audit at the end and you find that you've missed things, you can track back to, well, why did we miss this? Did we miss completely an about statement that we need to add? Did we miss a synonym? You're really building a methodology, whereas with keywords it can be very haphazard. And as I said, what I've seen happen is people just, they sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil, or maybe at their computer, but they just try to come out the top of their heads, and they might go to a thesaurus and use that for an aid, but there's no audit of that list of keywords. And that's really where the trouble starts, when you just kind of start throwing words out there and there's no methodology to ensure the comprehensiveness of what you're doing.
Okay. Next question is, my outside counsel owns this process now. Why should the corporation get involved in the process?
Bobby, you want to take that one? Bobby?
Bobby, you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. I was. This goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago, where the organization owns the risk. Additionally, the organization is held to a standard of knowing its own content and is in a much better position to define the criteria in a uniform fashion, and more importantly, to define what the requirements are as it relates to the entities it's being held responsible for complying with. As I said, the organization knows all of its regulators, knows all of the protected content, or should know the content that it has in its organization that they need to be aware of, and is in a much better position to uniformly define the categories of protected content and to define the criteria to identify that. And that's really the starting point for this, as opposed to relying upon outside counsel to hopefully spot it when they see it and to prevent it from being produced.
Okay, and the next question we have is, how do I ensure I've identified all of my protected content documents?
It's one of the reasons that we recommend the testing at the end. As I said, no one is ever going to be 100% sure. Whether you look at every single document with really experienced reviewers, everybody makes mistakes. But what you can and should strive to do is to, using sampling, which is a common methodology to evaluate effectiveness of a process. Using sampling will at least give you some insurance as to, we did our due diligence, we did the best that we could, here's the words that the queries that we created, here's the testing that we did, we tested to a 95% certainty, so we have that level of confidence in the quality of the work. And that really, there's never ever going to be a 100% guarantee that you captured everything. But what you can do is to get at least a test to a certain level of confidence, and that should improve your comfort level.
Okay, great. And one more question. Excuse me. How do I get started?
I think that the best way to get started is to pick one particular type of protected content, whether it be confidential supervisory information or some other category that you believe is of greatest risk to your organization presently, and to begin the process of examining how that information may be represented, to create a word list of a sample corpus from your document collection, and to create the workflow working with your vendor to create the screening process, the process to ensure that outside counsel has reviewed everything that's been potentially flagged, and the process to ensure that documents that were flagged are not part of any sort of production criteria. Once you create the workflow and the process for a particular type of protected content, then it's much easier to expand and to create a similar process for a different type of protected content. So I would suggest starting with the type of content and beginning the process, creating the initial workflow, and then take each category one at a time to define the criteria.
Okay, great. And with that, I think we will wrap up for today. Thank you for attending today's web seminar, Identifying and Managing Protected Content for the Financial Services Industry. If you have any additional questions you would like to ask the presenters, please email Kathy Rogers at kathy.rogers@renewdata.com. An archive will be made available for today's presentation. An email will be sent once it is available for access. On behalf of our speakers and Renew Data, thank you for your time today, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.